Welcome to session 4. I hope that you all enjoyed the braai last night. Actually, we found out what happened to Nelmary's chickens. It was served last night. So I hope you all enjoyed the braai last night. Thank you to the organizers who organized that event for us. This session deals with rangeland ecology and management, and we've got a lot of exciting talks this morning. We've got, most of them are 15-minute presentations, and then we've got 2 short presentations at the end of the session. And I really look forward to hearing what these esteemed researchers are going to tell us. As a keynote speaker, I'd like to introduce Professor Richard Finn. His talk will deal with flexible grazing management to balance the nutrient needs of livestock and sustain rangeland production, evaluating the evidence. So we look forward to that. But before he comes up, let me just please tell you a little bit about Richard. He's currently employed at the Okavango Research Institute in Maun, Botswana, where he's an associate professor in rangeland ecology. His research interests include vegetation ecology, plant-herbivore interactions, herbivore ecology, and community-based conservation. A key focus of his research is optimal livestock management and linking this to plant seasonal above and below ground growth patterns, ecophysiology, and large herbivore seasonal adaptive foraging strategies. Richard has, in his career, authored or co-authored 57 journal articles and 5 book chapters. Richard, welcome, and we look forward to what you're going to tell us. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning. And firstly, I'd just like to thank the Grassland Society for giving me this opportunity to present this keynote. I'm honored and thankful for that. And yeah, it's an important topic that I think we need to inject some life into, so hopefully we can do something in this talk with that. I also just want to acknowledge my co-authors on this presentation. It's actually, the presentation is built on the back of a paper that we're currently working on. So I've basically just adapted it from the paper. And also just want to acknowledge the late Clive Bunting. Many in KZN will know him, but he was a brilliant farmer and developed some brilliant techniques which we are going to present on a lot today, actually. And without his work on his farm, we would have a lot less to say today. So we're really grateful to Clive for what he did. How does this change the slides, huh? Okay. Okay, so rangeland science appears to have hit a bit of a dead end in grazing management research, because all the analytical work on through meta-analyses are showing that only stocking rate is really the variable that's influencing rangeland composition and animal performance, and not the grazing management system. So this is coming out clearly, and it's coming out in a lot of studies from rotational grazing systems, adaptive multi-paddock grazing systems, and holistic management. None of them are really showing strongly. Yes, there's some little bits of evidence here and there, but there's no overwhelming evidence that grazing management strategy is having much of an influence. It's all about stocking rates, and that's a bit of a problem, because really then what do we do as managers? Because we just need a stock, and that's the only thing we need to do, get the right stocking rate. In this presentation, we will explain why rotational grazing has not shown advantages over continuous grazing systems. We'll try and pull out some of the key concepts here. And we'll also present data from various studies showing that you do get improved rangeland condition and animal performance when you get the key concepts right in the grazing management strategy. So the first key concept that I want to get across, which is critical, is what we call the dilution effect. Okay, the dilution effect works on nutrients. That nutrient concentration decreases as grass height and biomass increase because of a higher carbon content in the tissue. Okay, And so this is a well demonstrated, and you can't violate this principle. As grasses get bigger, they lose their nutrient concentration. There's a nice classic paper on this by Gerald and Beverly and some others. This one recently just come out in Rangeland Ecology and Evolution, nutrient dilution in the future of herbivore populations. And what they're showing is that, yeah, as grass height increases, then so does all the nutrients go down. Okay, so it's a problem for herbivores. It means the taller the grass gets, the older the grass gets, the lower the quality for the herbivores. Okay, but it also affects digestibility. Okay, because as grasses mature, they require more indigestible compounds, cellulose and lignin, which reduce digestibility. Okay, and that has a problem for the animal, because lower digestibility means less forage intake, because the ruminant, especially the ruminant, the rumen gets blocked up by indigestible material. It takes a long time to pass through the rumen, and the animal can't eat while it's waiting for the rumen to clear. So it reduces intake per day. Okay, and then it not only reduces intake, but it's of what the animal does take in has lower nutrient concentration. So it's a double whammy for the animal. Less to eat, and what it does eat is lower quality. So this really impacts nutrition. So this study which was done in Botswana by Mosianyani, but Norman Smith published it in his book chapter. And the red line shows rainfall events. And what you can see is that there's three grasses, Digitaria eriantha, which they called decumbens there in the old days. Then Panica maxima and Ergosus rigidio, common grasses in Botswana. And what you see is the nutrient concentration goes down very quickly as soon as they start to grow, soon after the rainfall. So their highest quality is generally when they are the smallest. Okay. And then you can see it differs between different species. Okay, which is important, because different species can then result in selective grazing effects when they differ in quality. And the digestibility is also going down. Okay. So there's another problem, though, because not only do we see this dilution effect, it's getting worse under climate change. This recent paper points out the big problem that herbivores today are getting poorer quality forage than herbivores 50 years ago. Okay. And it's getting worse over time. The more the carbon goes up in the atmosphere, the worse the quality of the forage for herbivores. And this is a very important point for grazing managers to understand, because you have to manage for this in your grazing management system. If you don't explicitly include this into your system, your animals are going to suffer. And this is the problem we are seeing, which I'll get into today, is rotational grazing systems explicitly manage in the opposite way to actually make it worse. So what are the implications of the dilution effect for grazing management? Okay. Well, there's a lot of studies that show when grass is kept shorter and high quality, animal populations are more productive. Okay, so there's good evidence for that. Okay, and that's what is known as facilitation of grazing principle. It's a well-known principle in herbivore ecology, but it hasn't been well taken up by rangeland science at all. And violating this principle means reduced weight gain for your animals, poor conception and calving rates. These are all been shown by a lot of these studies. Smaller, weaker calves at birth, longer age to first conception. Instead of conceiving after maybe 1 year or 2 years, you conceive only after 3 years. Fewer calves over the cow's lifespan. So this means a less productive system for the farmer. And when you are a commercial farmer, you are dependent on your cattle productivity. And when your cattle productivity is really bad, that's going to put you into economic big trouble. So yet, despite what we know now, yet violating the facilitation of grazing principle is explicitly built into rotational grazing systems. Instead of trying to deal with it, it explicitly reinforces it. Okay, because what happens is when you rest a paddock for months before you put your cattle in, which is what happens in a rotational grazing system, you maybe have 1 month or 2 months. Generally, it's at least 2 months rest. In many systems, it's up to 3-4 months. You're allowing that grass to grow out and lose quality, lose digestibility, and then you put the cattle in. And especially in these systems which promote rapid, like short duration in the paddock, before they can get any chance to benefit from any high quality regrowth, they move to the next low quality paddock. So you're reinforced over time, one paddock after paddock of low quality food. So the animals can never access good quality food. And this is going to get worse under climate change. So it's a big problem. This is an example of a photo by Kevin. I'm not sure exactly where it was. Where was this photo, Kevin? Porte, okay. What you can see there is that's what a rotational grazing system will offer you. Okay, I'm not saying that was a rotational grazing system there, but just as an example, that's what, after months of rest, that's what the cattle will be getting. Compared to what Clive Bunting was doing, and we'll get into that now, is burning. He have set aside some of his paddocks as priority paddocks for the season, burn them, and then put the cattle in immediately that the grass gets to a reasonable sort of height that they can get some forage intake, and then keep it short all season. You don't allow that grass to grow out in that priority paddock. It's grazed short and flat for the season. If it gets too short, you can move them to your rested, you're not your long-term rested paddocks for the whole year, but you have grazed paddocks that are unburned. You move them into those but you always bring them back to that high quality paddock as soon as you see it's beginning to reach a critical grass height. Cattle back, so you never allow it to grow back. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out which paddock your cattle are going to do better in. Okay, and there's a lot of evidence for this. We now have really good evidence for this. This study done in the 50s by Botha in Athol, the top figure. The blue line represents exactly that, where you've burned and then the cattle are put in immediately. There's enough grass to eat. Okay, and that's weight gain on the y-axis there. The red line represents you burn, but then you give it at least a month to grow out. And at the same time, the cattle are eating, while you're waiting for that month, they're eating in low quality, unburned grassland. Okay. And then only do they get put in. So you can see it has a big effect on weight gain. Okay. Between the early graze and the late graze treatment. And the same work was done by Pete Zak for his PhD at Dooney with sheep. And you can see a massive effect on production. Okay, but the interesting thing is over time that advantage goes down. Okay, over 10 years with that study, and I think it was 6 with Pete's. That no longer do you have that advantage, and the reason is because although the stocking rates are set right here, there's no rest period in any year. It's every year graze. So you're never allowing those perennial grasses to recover their vigor, etc. So over time, the productivity of the system is going down. So this also is very good evidence that we need these long recovery periods every alternate year, preferably, to prevent that sort of effect happening. And we'll get more into that now. So Clive's system, you can see that's his priority paddock, and the cattle keep that grass short all season. And it has not only good for the cattle production, but you can see it's very good for non-selective grazing as well. And we'll look at the data that actually shows how the outcome of this, everything eaten, the palatables and the unpalatables. Okay. So the productivity before, up to 1994, for 40 years, they had a rotational grazing system, 4-paddock rotational grazing system. And what you can see is that they were getting 119 kilograms on average with cattle weight gain for a season. And when they moved to the priority paddock system, 147 kilograms per of weight gain. This is from his master's thesis. This data, I think Pete Zak was his supervisor for that. So the good thing is we have the data from Clive's system because he was a diligent farmer and did a master's actually on his work. Yeah. The other thing he noted was that the nearby Everley Research Farm, cattle reached marketable weight. Only 38% of cattle were reaching marketable weight after 2.5 years. The same cattle breed, Bonsmara, they only 38% were reaching marketable weight at 2.5 years, but 97% at Clive's farm because of the improved growth rates. Okay, so you can see as a farmer, this has huge advantages. Then it's not just weight gain that suffers under this. We should also expect that conception rates are going to suffer greatly. And a vet called Yapi Jackson, who was employed by the Ministry of Agriculture in Zimbabwe, he did over 1 million pregnancy diagnoses in his career. And what he noticed, which inspired him to write this paper, was that those systems, because at that time short duration grazing systems were very popular in Zimbabwe, and what he noticed was the short duration grazing systems had terrible conception rates. Okay, at the light stocking, they were at 70% conception rate, which is already terrible. You're heading towards bankruptcy at 70%. And at heavy stocking, they were down to 46%. Okay, but under continuous grazing, where the cattle are put in for the whole season, it's not necessarily that it's a continuous grazing system. I'm not sure exactly if these were all considered or more like a seasonal grazing rest system. But what you were seeing is that as stocking rate increased, you actually got better and better conception rates. And the reason for this, I believe, is because the higher stocking rates resulted in the cattle being able to keep the grass in a shorter, higher quality state, and that improved their conception rate. So this again points out to that facilitation of grazing principle. But it just shows these intensive rotational grazing systems like short duration, for conception, it's a disaster, and for growth rates. But it's not just weight gain, conception, calving rates that suffer with rotational grazing systems. It's also selective grazing that increases under rotational grazing. Okay, this is because livestock are forced to graze selectively. When you allow the grass to mature and lose quality, then they obviously have to go for what can give them the best quality to eat, because nothing is good quality, but they really have to go selectively. So you're reinforcing selective grazing under a rotational grazing approach. And we saw this in Clive's system with that. You see that non-selective grazing with the priority paddock. And then, okay, before we look at Clive's data, I just want to show you some work from Kevin Kirkman's PhD work, I think it was, at Ethel. And what you see here is that this is the year after in the year of grazing, they protected certain areas from grazing. Those are the open bars, and then the other areas were grazed. So the next year, this is what you're seeing is the next year's productivity. The areas that were protected from grazing the previous year were much more productive in the next year than the areas that got grazed the previous year. This is because, we'll look at more of this data now, is that you're really impacting your root production under grazing. Okay, so the next year they've got poor root systems, so they can't grow properly. But what you see, interestingly, is that the unpalatable grasses show the opposite effect. And this is because you've hammered the root systems of your palatable grasses with selective grazing, because this was a rotational grazing system that they were using here. And what you see is that because you've hammered the root systems of your palatable grasses, the unpalatables now the next year have got no competition. They can just grow willy-nilly. And because they didn't get heavily grazed the year before, they're now really productive. So this is how you change a sword very quickly from good grasses to bad grasses, because you just give the good grasses a competitive advantage in the system. And at Clive's system, we saw that under that rotational grazing strategy that they used to have, Hyperemia Herta dominated at 33.9%, and Themida was only down at 8.7%. But when they switched to the priority paddock system, within 8 years, the whole situation had changed. Hyperemia Herta went down to 15%, and Themida up to 21.5% in 8 years, and became the dominant. So you can see how non-selective grazing can really give an advantage to your palatable grasses, and Themida is a classic example of that. It's very competitive under non-selective grazing. So this is just brilliant evidence from Clive's system again that rotational grazing doesn't work. It's really there's a lot of conceptual faults to rotational grazing, and this is why we're not seeing in the literature, in the analytical work, that rotational grazing is coming out as having much effect. Here's a work that I did in Botswana. I presented this last year, but I'll just quickly run through it. Again, we saw the big productive grasses. This was under seasonal, it's not under rotational grazing, but it's season-long grazing and resting, but no priority paddock system. So we didn't have that explicit thing to eliminate selective grazing. And what you see is the big productive grasses like Erogostus rigidio on the various farms. This is Tisa, the Erogostus rigidio and Staphygrostis uniformis. They increased in abundance over the 5 years of monitoring. And then the high quality grasses, Digitaria eriantha and Brachyuria nigropodata, didn't increase at all. Why? Because of selective grazing. There was no priority paddock in there to eliminate that selective grazing. But on the one farm called Misha, which is part of TISA, but it's a different section of TISA, and their management had obviously been different in the past. It hadn't been as badly degraded, and there was a much higher abundance of Digitaria eriantha. And there we saw Digitaria eriantha increase rapidly. And so I suspect it's because there's less selective grazing, where there's a high abundance. The selective grazing is not as impactful as when you've got a low abundance of your high quality grasses. But again, selective grazing appears to be really impacting these systems. So, okay, we've looked at the forage quality effects and how it influences for animal performance, selective grazing. Now let's look at some of the effects on resting. Okay, we also get these big temporal mismatches of management with ecosystem variables under rotational grazing. And this, it's well known that nitrogen mineralization in soils is highest in spring, and then it declines. So you can see that at Kruger. This is Stephen Higgins, William Bond's work there. The first 3 months of the growing season, the nitrogen mineralization was much higher. Okay, and then it really went low for the last 3 months of the growing season. Okay, and so you can see much lower there. So this has implications for grazing management, because if you're in a rotational grazing system and your first 3 months is when you're going to be resting, okay, that's fine. You're going to get good nitrogen mineralization in your soils, and you're going to get the plants can take up nitrogen nicely while they're resting. But if they're resting in the second half of the season, they're not going to get nice nitrogen uptake. So your rest is going to be much less effective. So this is the problem when you graze a paddock at part of the season and you rest at part of the season, which is how rotational grazing systems work. They don't rest for the whole season. You're always going to get a mismatch of this nitrogen mineralization effect, and you're going to get a mismatch in root growth. We see this this is Henny Sneemann's work in Bloem area, and you can see that the highest root production was actually towards the end of April. Okay, and the same, excuse me, in the Serengeti, there the dry season's a bit later, so there, but you can see that big peak later in the early dry season. Why then? It's because the grasses are taking their above ground nutrients and trying to put them below ground for the winter, okay, or the dry season. So they're pushing down roots rapidly at this time to try and store their above ground material. So if you graze, if your grazing period, you rested early in the season, that's fine, but now you graze when the plants are trying to put down their roots, okay, to store above ground material. A, you take off those nutrients that they could have stored below ground by grazing it off, and then, thanks. B, you stop the root growth, okay? So the next season, that plant is going to be much less productive than if it wasn't grazed at that time. So this is a big problem. How do you deal with this in a rotational grazing system? Because what you want is every season, at the beginning of the season, when your grazing season, you want your grasses looking like that. This is cutting frequency. You can see the ones that were uncut have the biggest root systems. So a good long rest allows that to happen, okay? And if you don't rest properly, you're going to get much weaker root systems. And there's good evidence for that. This is Dennis Barnes' work at Ethel, I think it was. And the first treatment number 1 is no grazing at all in the previous season. Okay, this is like the previous season, and then you're looking at the next year's, the residual effects. Root growth was much more when you didn't graze the previous season. For Trachypogon, for Thamida, it's not as pronounced, but it's still quite a big decline just with light grazing. Treatment number 2 is a light graze from December to early January. Okay, then no grazing. So you're resting the rest of the growing season, and even with that whole rest, that long rest for the rest of the growing season, still big reduction in root production. So you can see this just resting part of the season, it just doesn't do the job. And it's because of these mismatches between the ecosystem variables like nitrogen mineralization and root production patterns, etc., and the resting period. You see this work nicely, this effect nicely in the prairie grasslands. In year 1, these grasses, the year before, they were rested the whole year. So when they got clipped in year 1, they were very productive because they had those big root systems. So they even were overcompensating, giving higher productivity. Okay. But because now for year 1, they got clipped up to 8 times in the season, some of the treatments, then year 2, their root production is going to be very poor. So what happens when you clip them in year 2? Very low productivity because the roots have gone. That's why. And year 3, even worse. So this is how you run down the productivity of a rangeland, by not properly allowing the grasses to rest and build up their root systems. And this, you can be operating in a rotational grazing system in year 2 type scenarios and not know that you are there, because you don't have anything to compare with. You see, this is the productivity you get in your grassland, and you think this is what you should be getting, but it's not. You're way below what you should be getting because of your resting, the way you're resting your grasses. So never mind worrying about the negative effects of the second bite. The first bite can have a big effect, as Dennis Barnes showed with that work and some others. And so just to illustrate this nicely then, with proper rainfall data from Okavango Research Institute's weather station, and what you see, obviously, those are the rainfall events, those bars, and then soil nitrogen mineralization is going to be that type. That's going to be your peak soil nitrogen mineralization, and your peak roots growth is going to be then, okay? But if you're resting then, okay, you get good rainfall, you're getting good nitrogen mineralization, so you're getting a good rest then, but you're missing that period of maximum root growth, so you're not going to get optimal root production for the next season, okay? If you're resting later in the season, you're getting terrible rainfall, you're getting no nitrogen mineralization, those grasses are getting a terrible rest, but that paddock is treated the same as the other one. They both considered got 2 months rest, and they didn't get the same type of rest at all, and none of them got optimal rest. The optimal rest is resting the whole season, okay? That allows all the variables to be incorporated, no mismatches at all, and you're going to get optimal root production under that scenario. So just to finish off then, let's look at some of the foraging ecology and seasonal habitat selection patterns and how this relates to grazing management systems, because as we know, some popular grazing management approaches claim to simulate the movement patterns of large herds of grazers of the past. They're saying that these big herds moved quickly through an area, and big dense herds, they trampled and grazed and ate everything down non-selectively. And then, to be nice to the grasses, they didn't come back for months to allow them to rest properly. Okay, so foraging ecology theory and the observations of a lot of studies show that those ideas are merely perceptions, they're not reality. Okay, lots of studies showing that on different continents, bison in Kansas on the 4-year burns, they keep those 4-year burns short all season. Those grasses don't grow out on the 4-year burns. Why? It's because those have the highest forage quality there. So there's no just passing through and then leaving it for months to grow out. They keep it short the whole season. And the Serengeti, exactly the same. The Serengeti grasslands, if you want to read McNaughton's paper in 1985, I don't have time to put all he put in there, but he's got a lot of interesting statements in there. They move in there and they keep it short the whole season. They might move off an area, but as soon as they see there's regrowth in those areas, they come back and they graze that area. He says the only thing that you see on those grasses is leaf. There's no stem development whatsoever. Okay, so does this sound like big herds of herbivores moving through and then moving on and leaving this area to recover for months and months? No, it doesn't work like that. Studies in the Eastern Cape show that wildebeest return to graze sites every 2 to 3 days. That study is just out now. And then a study done in Kruger and Flisserie on buffalo show every 10 to 15 days they're coming back to sites. But buffalo will take a bit longer because they like grass a bit taller, so they will let it grow a bit longer. But they come back, excuse me, to get that regrowth. So no sane herbivore is going to just leave an area for months and months before coming back to eat, because you're just not going to survive like that. Then large herbivore movements between short. So what we're seeing, this pattern is there's a lot of studies all across Africa and other continents showing that. So the herbivores tend to use a short, high quality range during the growing season and then move to a taller, adequate quality range during the dry season, because the taller, adequate quality range provides the reserve of food for the dry season. So buffalo and gazelles in Serengeti show that pattern on a tenal sequence. Bison in the prairie show that effect. Zebra in Botswana, white rhino and Shishluyo umfolozi. So a wide variety of different herbivores are showing this effect. Okay, and the reason for that is because Norman Owen Smith has modeled it Okay, but we also have a lot of observational evidence to support his models. And what he is showing is that if you only have access to taller grassland, like you have in a rotational grazing system, waiting for months for that grass to mature, that's the productivity of your system. You're going to have very low productivity in the system because there's no reproduction in the system because of the very low forage quality. Okay, so the population is going to stay at low levels. Okay, if you only have tall grass short, high quality grass in the system, that's great for when you have good rainfall years. Okay, population is going to explode, but come a drought, there's no reserve of food for the dry season, and the population collapses. Okay, the optimal solution is to have a mix of short and tall grassland, and this is exactly why we see these herbivores moving. They have a short wet season range when they need the quality, then they move to a dry season, a lower quality but reserve of food for the dry season. Okay, and rotational grazing systems don't provide that. They tend to manage for uniformity, uniform structure, and you really don't get that effect at all. And so the limitations of rotational grazing systems, they fail to address the dilution effect. It leads to poor animal performance and selective grazing. They cause temporal mismatches with key ecosystem variables, leading to poor recovery of your grasses. And they do not simulate wildlife foraging patterns. Okay. So how do we apply these key concepts? Just a few notes on this. It's fairly simple. What needs to be done is that if you've just got a 4-paddock system, so your farm is split up into a bunch of 4-paddock cells, okay? This is not your whole farm, just one cell, and you have a herd for each cell. Then what you do is in your priority paddock, that's the one you burn in the spring, and then you keep it short. But as soon as the grasses are at decent heights to graze, you put the cattle in and you make sure they keep it short. If they graze it too short because there's no rain, you move them to the reserve paddock, which is a unburned paddock, but it's still in the grazing cycle. Okay, while the other 2 paddocks are resting for the whole season. Okay, this is what we're doing at Khanzi, except that we don't have the priority paddock in there. And I've advised the farmers that this is what they need to do now to improve. Okay, so the priority paddock is making sure they get the high quality food, and it's also getting that non-selective grazing going in that paddock. Okay, then the rested paddocks allowing that grass to grow out, and you have a tall reserve of food for the dry season. And what we're seeing is even in low rainfall years at Khanzi in Botswana is that they never run out of food. Kevin Grant at TISA, he's never ever had to sell off cattle under the system, even in bad years. Okay, that's an example from TISA there. That's the rested paddock in the background. And so this is in May, just before you would move the cattle across to the rested paddock. And you can see they've built up that big reserve of food under that approach. Okay. So just acknowledgements, Clive Bunting for his insightful development of the priority paddock approach. Kevin Grant, Cliffy Biggs, and Casper Labuskakny for the development of season-long grazing and resting approaches in Botswana. Some of you may know Casper Labuskakny and Cliffy Biggs, the pastures people. They're big dairy farmers also down in Eastern Cape, also getting cattle farming going up in Botswana. And then Teresa Finn for help with fieldwork and data capture. Been a big help there. And then I always just like to acknowledge the infinite mind of the creator when we work in these systems and see the amazing complexity of these systems. It says in Psalm 147 verse 5, his understanding is infinite. Thanks very much.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Richard, for that very insightful talk. We've got about 15 minutes for question time, because I'm sure there are lots of maybe not even questions, maybe some debates going on. There's Justin and Susie and Urs. So let's take them in that order. Justin, where's the microphones?
Richard, thanks so much. That was fascinating, and I'm delighted that your talk was upgraded to a plenary. It's really valuable. Thank you. My question is, you're talking kind of about grassland systems. You're talking about grassland systems where where the quality decreases over time. What about, and then you looked at the grazing and the resting. What about sweet felt systems where your grass quality doesn't really decrease over time? How would you modify your general approach, or wouldn't you?
Because the data presented from Norman Owen Smith's day, that was from Botswana, which is, I suppose, it's a semi-arid, it's not a soil-felt system, and there you're still seeing a big difference in forage quality between the good grasses and the poorer grasses, and definitely you saw that strong decrease in nutrient concentration over time. So yes, the effect is not as bad. The winter grazing is not as bad in sweet felt systems. The soil felt is a real different baby then, for winter grazing. But it's during the growing season, both of them show that the optimal forage quality is going to be when the grass is kept short, but they won't decline to the same degree as a soil felt system. But still, if you want to get optimal animal performance and reduce selective grazing, you're going to still have to present them with that short, high quality grass. So we're seeing that in Botswana. I wouldn't say it's an optimal sweet felt system because it's sandy soils. So probably it'd be maybe your basalt soils in Kruger. It might be a bit different, but still, from work there, you still have a big variation in grass height, and it's anywhere where you get enough grass productivity. That's the key thing I would advise on, is understanding the grass productivity of a system. If you are in a very arid area, okay, like parts of Namibia, parts of the Karoo, etc., where there's not enough growth to really lose quality, okay, you don't get enough growth, okay, then it's a bit different, okay. But in most of those seem to be more the exceptions, southern part of Botswana down to less than 200 mils maybe. Western Namibia, you're getting very low rainfall. There, you might not need to worry about this dilution effect much. But most systems, semi-arid and higher rainfall areas, then especially. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So.
I'm going to be naughty and ask two. Is that allowed? So my first question is, it's very interesting to see this in the wildlife system. So you mentioned those migratory systems in the Serengeti where, there's the second bite, the third, the fifth. When do these grasses get their optimal root growth in, if this happens year after year after year?
Yeah, so the difference with the Serengeti grasses is obviously that those are grazing lawn grasses that can tolerate, they don't have a seasonal rest, as in a cattle system where you don't have those grazing lawn grasses. There you're going to have that seasonal rest, okay? But in these migratory systems, those short grasses are adapted to heavy grazing. They're lawn grasses, so they can tolerate that year after year after year of heavy grazing. Grasses like Sporobilus clados is a good example. And so, but with a cattle system, that's not the case. You don't have your lawn grasses. So there you've got to create the lawn-like effect for the one season, but then you have to rest for the next season for sure. Because those, you've hammered it for the one season, the next season it needs a full year's rest after that. But wildlife systems is not necessarily the case. Yeah.
And speaking of wildlife systems, how could one, if you were in charge of like a game farm or a game reserve, and you're still dealing with those sorts of issues, how could you ensure that this dilution effect, like I've started working at Tali in the Kalahari, and they're really worried about their felt condition because there's a lot of those big stemmy arid grasses.
Yeah.
I mean, would fire potentially be a way of attracting animals to revisit a patch for a year?
Yeah, fire. And, really what I would suggest, especially under the dilution effect with climate change, is that we really need to think about incorporating cattle into these systems, okay, to use them for management purposes. Because what you can do with the cattle, and there's a very nice example in Zimbabwe at the Oppenheimer's ranch up there. It's Shangani, yeah. There they're using the cattle, managing the cattle very well, and then creating short and tall grass areas. But that's what you need to do. Is fire does have some effect because you burn it down and get it high quality, but then it quickly grows out unless you can manage to get the wildlife to keep it short. But what you can do with cattle is to make sure that it's kept short, okay, for the whole season. And the other thing you can do with cattle is to create these nutrient hotspots in the system by corral the cattle at nighttime, and you put all this huge dung input. So you corral them for months or up to a month or so in the corral. Then you move the corral to a new spot, and that grows up again, and it leaves a nutrient hotspot there that your wildlife benefit from. So you can, cattle and wildlife can coexist very nicely, especially where you want in these smaller systems like Swallow and etc., where it's no longer really a natural system. You know, you can use cattle to manage to create these variables. And you know, the interesting thing is that we in Kruger, when we were working in Kruger, we found this effect in Kruger. Actually, you think of Kruger as this big pristine system, and they manage it. We want to manage for pristine, but it's not the case. You know, we set up grazing exclosures on some very heavily grazed areas, thinking, okay, this is great for grazing exclosures. We'll see what now when you exclude grazing. Okay. Then when we were showing people around there who had a bit of insight into archaeological things, they said, oh, look here, grave sites. We didn't even notice them, you know, and look here, milling stones and things. Then we realized these nutrient hotspots are probably because of human effects in the past. While these areas that we selected as heavily grazed sites are actually areas that people had cattle there in the past, maybe 500 years ago or something, and they've created these nutrient hotspots. And now our wildlife system is benefiting from this. And interesting, because I took some soil samples from there, and I gave them to our guy at UKZN, Tad Dorasamy, who was the lab technician there. And I said, can you do some analysis? He came back to me. I said, hey, I think I've made a mistake with the sodium content. It's way too high, you know. And I said, no, I doubt you've made a mistake. Those things are, it's because of those hotspots there, you know. So, you know, I think we need to really rethink also with conservation, you know, especially in human wildlife systems, is how do we best integrate these things? And cattle can be a very good way of doing that. Yeah.
You were next. Speak with them.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for thought-provoking presentation. There was one slide, I know we need to go back to it, where you talked about biomass, of root biomass, but actually the y-axis had a different descriptor on it. You may want to double check on that. What? It was actually showed basal cover. So
it basal cover?
Yeah. Yeah. So just have a look at that. But anyway, a more general comment, and it's a problem I have with a lot of critics of rotational grazing, is that it's a catch-all term, and I wish we would get rid of it, because it actually doesn't say anything about what producers are doing. You can use different configurations of paddocks in a number of different ways to move animals across the landscape. And, you know, it's a big challenge that's being created by people who've reviewed the literature. And one of my former colleagues, I won't say who it is, wrote that 2008 paper where they basically said rotational grazing has no effect. But there was so much conflation of information there. And I think we've got to be really careful when we talk about rotational grazing, is what are we actually talking about? Yeah. What are the producers doing? Because two different people can use almost exactly the same system or the same configuration and get really different results. Yeah. And so I think we've got to be really careful. And the whole thing of rotation has this connotation of being a recipe, that we got to leave them for a week, take them out for 4 weeks, or leave them for a month and take them out for X number of months. And in all of these systems, as you mentioned, they're dynamic. You have different precipitation. They're going to change over time. So the adaptivity aspect, I think, is really critical. Yeah. And if you're going to be adaptive, then how do you do that without constricting your animals to certain areas and then moving them at certain times when forage decreases? Yeah. I mean, you can destock, but that's not always possible. So you need to be able to move them. And there's some sort of configuration where you can exclude animals from certain areas and reintroduce them to other areas, I think is critical. And then just sort of in my last aspect there was, you showed this one slide where the thing had been pretty much grazed into the ground and all the standing forage in the rest camp. Yes. But from what you said, that's exactly not the place where you want to put the animals, because that grass is all grown out and it's the nutrient quality would be very low. Yeah, true. But that's, remember, for the dry season. So that's exactly what you see with the herbivore. Any wildlife system, they use a high quality wet season range, then they move to a lower quality dry season range. The lower quality dry season range is just to give them enough food to get through the dry season. It's a reliable source of food.
which you won't find in the high quality range because everything gets eaten out. So it's the same in those cattle systems, is that you're giving them the high quality in the growing season, and then the dry season you're making sure there's enough food for them. And what you do is although it's lower quality, you can give them a protein lick if needed to help digest that food. But when Kevin's actually finding he doesn't even need to give them a protein lick. They're still doing fine on that grass over the dry season because it's probably not a sourfelt system. If it was a sourfelt system, it's a different story. There you're going to have to put in quite a bit of licks and things, protein licks and things to get them through it. But actually, the idea is to make sure you have enough food for the dry season, because if you run out of food in the dry season, you're in serious trouble as a cattle farmer, because you cannot afford to buy in food for your animals. That's going to kill you economically, So resting at least half your available area is critical. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Richard. That was a great presentation. I'm this side. I can see you're trying to look for.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Yes. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I would like to discuss the part where you talk about the nutrient dilution hypothesis. The paper that you showed at the beginning, fortunately I got to look at it last week, and I'm interested to know your opinion about the potential implications this dilution effect would have for mammalian herbivores, because the paper deals a lot with the insect in terms of them having to change their feeding behavior to more, I believe they said sip feeding or something like that. And but I'm curious about the potential impact that this dilution effect would have to mammalian herbivores in the wild in the long run.
Yeah, so it affects a wide range. I think that paper, excuse me, that paper points out it affects insect herbivores, it affects mammalian herbivores, the whole range. Anything that's got to get a critical concentration of, say, protein in its diet. If that protein, if it's diluted too much, herbivores are going to battle. That's why often these nutrient hotspots in the ecosystem are highly valued by mammalian herbivores. They concentrate their grazing as soon as there's growth on those areas. They onto those areas to get that high quality, because they're not getting it in the taller areas. Yeah, so we used to see that in those Kruger sites, that as soon as there was rain, everything flocked onto those hotspots for white rhino, wildebeest, impala, you name it. They would eat everything off. And then if there was no rain for a while, they would go back to the taller areas, and then as soon as the rain came again, they were back to get that high quality. So yeah, so it definitely affects your mammalian herbivores in a big way, and there's a lot of nice studies also in East Africa showing how the herbivores actually do use those hotspots very, very stringently. Yeah. And they actually, I think David Augustine shows that without those nutrient hotspots in the system, the animals wouldn't get the reproductive level amounts of phosphorus in their diets. So dilution is a big issue. Yeah. No, it's not sodic sites. No, they're not the sodic sites. These are different. Yeah.
All right, time's up for questions now, but there might be some time at the end of the session for more discussion, because it seems like there's a bit of heavy discussion going on. I'd just like to thank Richard for his time, and on behalf of the GSSA, I would like to just give him a small gift.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, up to the next big hitter in this session, Professor Kevin Kirkman, and he seems to be thinking that all of us is, getting a bit grey and so on, and he'd like to remind us of some stuff. So he'll be talking about a forgotten parameter in grazing management, which is stocking intensity. Thank you, Kevin.
Good morning, and thank you. It's going to be quite weird pointing this pointer at the screen, because I can remember quite a few years ago, the late Rob Scott Shaw was given a faux pas award because he kept pointing the pointer at his laptop screen. So I think he was just a few years ahead of his time. When you come to managing livestock, there's really only three things you can do. You can manipulate the livestock type, either sheep, goats, cattle, or within the cattle class, you can look at different breeds, different sizes, etc. We're not going to talk about livestock type today at all. But the other two things you can manipulate is you can manipulate the number of cattle or livestock that you've got, and you can move them around. And those are really the only two things you can do when it comes to veld management. So there's been a lot of debate around stocking rate versus density, and we've all heard of high density stocking systems, ultra high density, very ultra high density, etc. And what does it actually mean? And what does density mean? I think we all know what stocking rate means. It refers to the livestock numbers, and it's got a time base to it. So it's the relationship between the number of animals and the total area of the land in one or more units utilized over a specified time, and it's an animal to land relationship over time. The time for stocking rate definitions usually refers to a year, and the units are typically some form of animal units per hectare per year. So animals per unit area per unit time. Stocking density is influenced by livestock movement. So if you crowd all your animals into a corner of your paddock or your farm, then they'll be there at a high density. So they've moved there. And the rest of the area where they've moved away from have got nothing. So the definition of density is the relationship between the number of animals and a specific unit of land being grazed at any one time, an instantaneous measure of the animal to land area relationship. It's got no relationship to stocking rate, and there's no time component to the definition, which is quite weird. And the units are typically animal units per hectare, with no reference to time. And yet, density is used to describe time-defined grazing systems or time-dependent grazing systems. But density's got no time in its definition. Okay, stocking rate is often linked to carrying capacity, and I think we all know that, but it's a fairly nebulous, site-specific, long-term concept of carrying capacity. I'm not going to go into that in much detail. Stocking rate really reflects the balance between forage production and consumption over that year period that you're referring to, and it can influence grazing selectivity, etc., etc. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on stocking rate. I think we all know what stocking rate means. For continuous grazing or single paddock systems, stocking rate is probably or will be the most important parameter because there's no movement, no managed movement. So you've just got stocking rate that you can vary, or animal numbers. As soon as you've got more than one paddock, then managed movement becomes increasingly important. And the more paddocks you've got, the more intensive the management and the more scope for error. Your animal performance is particularly dependent on that movement and any errors that you might make. If you put your animals into a paddock that's too tall, the quality is going to be low, performance will suffer, and I think Richard referred to that in his previous talk. If you leave your animals in a paddock too long, take them out when the grass is too short, intake will be reduced and performance will suffer. And then again, if you don't move the animals between paddocks adequately, you might get resource degradation as well. Okay, let's talk about density. Managed movement in a grazing system confines livestock to smaller areas for a specific time. Again, one paddock, continuous grazing, density equals the stocking rate. Two or more paddocks, density is greater than the stocking rate for a certain period of time. When you've got multi-paddocks, high to ultra-high density rotational grazing, the density is very high for a period of time. And this just illustrates those points that on the left, continuous grazing, if you've got 100 hectares and 100 animal units, the stocking rate is 1 animal unit per hectare or 1 hectare per animal unit, however you want to express it. Continuous grazing system, if you've got 2 paddocks, your density is twice as high. If you've got a lot of paddocks on the right, your density is very high. Okay. But again, what does that mean and how do you manage it? I agree with Urs in his question just now. The term rotational grazing's really got no precise meaning, and I think we actually need to do away with the term and come up with some alternate. But let's look at this stocking intensity, this forgotten parameter. Stocking intensity is defined as being the number of animals multiplied by the number of days in a paddock divided by the size of the paddock. So it's animals per unit area, animals for a specific time per unit area. And how does that differ from density, which is just animal units per hectare? So what's missing from density is time. In other words, the days in the paddock, or in extreme systems, maybe even the hours in a paddock. So does it make sense to use density as a measure or as a descriptor in a time-controlled grazing system? I don't think it does really. So if we go further into stocking intensity, animal performance and the impact of animals is affected by the interaction of paddock size, herd size, and very importantly, the period of stay. And stocking intensity brings that period of stay into the equation. Animal units by period of stay divided by hectares. If we look at that in isolation, if the period of stay is high, then generally performance is low. And there's data which I'll show shortly to back it up. If your paddock size is low, your performance is generally low. If your herd size is large, your performance is generally low per unit area. And so high stocking intensity generally results in low animal performance. Sorry, going the wrong way. I've got myself lost here, sorry. So getting back to time control in grazing systems, stocking rate is a time-dependent variable, normally for that period of a year. Density is independent of time, so it lacks usefulness in describing that animal-forage relationship in paddocks. But if you look at any literature, it's probably the most commonly used term at the moment in the debate to describe grazing systems or define grazing systems. But stocking intensity adds time to that description of animal-forage relationships in grazing systems, and I think that's what we should be using to describe our systems, plan our systems, and define our grazing systems. So animal unit grazing days per hectare allows for calculation of forage consumption in relation to forage supply. For an example, if one animal unit consumes 10 kilograms dry matter per day, for a 1 hectare paddock with 2,000 kilograms dry matter of forage available, you've got 200 animal unit days of forage available. So that could be 1 animal unit for 200 days. It could be 100 animal units for 2 days, 200 animal units for 1 day, or 400 animal units for half a day, etc. But there's a very clear definition of how long those animals can stay there. You've got the amount of forage, you've got the amount of animals, you've got the consumption, and you can relate those together. So if you assume a herd of 100 animal units on a 1 hectare paddock, and you vary just the period of stay, not the density, for a 5-day period in, stocking intensity would be 500 animal unit grazing days per hectare. Now 500 is greater than that 200 that we've got, so consumption is greater than supply. For a 2-day period in, stocking intensity is 200 animal unit grazing days per hectare, which is equal to the 200 days that we've got. So consumption equals supply. For a 1-day in period, stocking intensity is 100 animal unit grazing days per hectare, which is less than the 200 that we've got. So you can see in that example how you can calculate and work out your relationship between animals, time, and forage availability if you use stocking intensity. If you're using the term density to define or describe the grazing systems, well, density's got no time unit in it. Just some example, and this actually came from a paper by Denny and Barnes. And what they've got on the x-axis is grazing intensity from low on the left side to high on the right side, and body mass gains per steer. Very clear relationship between stocking intensity and animal performance. If you manage your stocking intensity to ensure animals get correct intake, you'll have good performance. If you don't manage it, performance will decline. So in conclusion, I think stocking intensity, which is that forgotten parameter, formalizes the relationship between forage supply and forage consumption over time in any movement managed grazing system. Note, I didn't say rotational grazing system. So we've got to come up with some other term to replace rotational grazing because it is a bit nebulous. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I think it's also a thought-provoking presentation, especially for those of us who are teaching students. You know, I think our mindset should change a little bit. There is time for a question or two if anybody would like to ask something. Justin? I just want to say that this free evening tonight around the braai, I think we need to brainstorm rotational grazing words.
Thanks, Kevin. That was very interesting. I love that sort of stuff. I seem to remember casting my mind back to when I was teaching this stuff at Fort Hare about 100 years ago, that stocking intensity was defined as stocking rate or animal units, sorry, per kilogram of forage available. Was that grazing pressure?
I think that's grazing pressure.
Is that grazing pressure?
Yeah.
And then that actually ties in with what you're saying there. And I agree completely. We need to get back to what we're actually meaning and not just use these vague terms. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. I don't know how to put this one. A regenerative agriculture advocate would say, why even bother consider time instead of considering the plant and how much it has been defoliated and how much it is going to be able to come back after you have removed the animals. Why time? Because time is not sensitive to the plant, and whether the plant now has been defoliated to a state where it needs to be left alone, or you still need to continue keeping the animal in there.
Thanks, Ntuthuka. I'm just trying to go back a slide, if I can. I think that the time is important, particularly when it comes to how much time the animals require to graze down the forage that's available. If you leave them for too long, in other words, if your stocking intensity increases, they will run out of food. And when they run out of food, they'll also have an impact on the grass. They'll graze it pretty flat and potentially start trampling what's left if they've been left in for too long. If you leave them in too short, then, okay, there we go. If we look at this last example here, we're varying the period of stay, not the density. So the period of stay is really the time. And I think that illustrates what happens when you vary that period of stay. If your period of stay is too long, animals will run out of food and they'll have a concomitant impact on the vegetation. If you get it right, then the animals will not run out of food and the impact on the resource is probably not as bad. If you leave them in for a period that's too short, well, there's going to be lots of food left over and it's not a very efficient use of that forage. And if you're in a rotational system, by the time you come back, that veld would have grown out very unevenly as a result of selective grazing. So I think the time is important. I think I get what you're saying with the regenerative agriculture movement and people talking, yeah. It may be that they're actually applying the principle of managing stocking intensity without realizing it, if they're doing it right. But I think it's better to actually be aware of the principle, be aware of what you're doing, and manage according to that. Thanks.
Thank you. That's fine. Thank you very much, Kevin. Again, if there's time at the end of the session, we might have some more questions for Kevin. Please let me invite our next speaker, who is staying with this concept of grazing intensity. Urs, we're looking forward to what you're going to tell us. Thank you.
All right, good morning all. Richard and Kevin couldn't have set this up better if they tried. My talk is actually doctoral work conducted by one of my best PhD students ever, Jenna Likens. She just recently graduated with her PhD and is now the research director of the Center for Grazing Lands and Ranch Management at Texas A&M University. So there's been a lot of debate about rotational grazing and the efficacies of rotational grazing. We've been talking about this kind of approach in different forms for, 70 plus years. And what's interesting is that there are so many different optimal methods that people come up with, and it becomes almost a recipe approach that you've got to do this to get it right. And then if you don't get it right, certain individuals will tell you, well, you just didn't do it the way I told you to do it, and say whom, but we know who we're talking about, right? And the bottom line is that there's been a lot of conflation of ideas. So Kevin's presentation was just perfect, and I was trying to think, where does it actually feed into in some of the indicators that I'm going to be talking about. So we characterize grazing management in a number of different ways, but the problem is there's a lack of standardized metrics for distinguishing alternative grazing management strategies. And this has contributed to some of these conflicting claims between people who, use mob grazing and say that there's this incredible effect on the rangeland and ultimately actually on productivity over time, whereas others will say there's no evidence for any benefit of moving animals across the rangeland, and it all basically is about stocking rate. So we've had all these different descriptors. More recently, this term adaptive multi-paddock grazing has been introduced. And I believe I am accurate in saying that I am actually the person who introduced that term. And it happened when Peter Bick, who's at Arizona State University, got together a group of people to compare the effects of high-intensity grazing, short-duration grazing, holistic resource management, and rotational grazing types of ideas with continuous grazing. And he said, no, I want to call it regenerative grazing. And I said, by all means, let's not introduce yet another term that is nebulous. We have so many things, resilience, sustainability. The concepts are fantastic, they're great. But how do we quantify them? And so I said, if we're going to use another term to try and get away from some of the baggage associated with the HRM issue or concepts, let's say what we're doing, and that's we're using multiple paddocks and we're trying to manage adaptively. And I said, and by the way, the acronym AMP is really great. It indicates energy and power. So that's where it came about. And then people have been trying to quantify it in a number of different ways or describe it at high level in a number of different ways. So adaptive rotations, stocking density plus grazing event length, multiple paddocks plus variable stocking rates plus seasonal variability, rest period lengths, stocking density plus variable stocking rates, and so on and so forth. Okay, so lots of different descriptors. But what's the common aspect? They all focus on different elements. And then it's not surprising that when we do comparisons and say, well, we don't know what to say because there's so much conflation. And so Jenna's research focused on two parts of the AMP grazing. One was on the grazing intensity aspect, and that's what I'm going to cover today. And the other aspect focused on the adaptive management approach, and we don't have time for that today. So, grazing intensity, defined as the cumulative effects of grazing animals on rangelands or pastures during a given period of time. That's generally what has been defined as grazing intensity. Okay, and different people have used different approaches to try and minimize the grazing impact over so to ensure that grazing intensity isn't so high that it overgrazes the rangeland and ultimately deteriorates it. That's certainly been one of the big challenges with continuous grazing systems, because animals will tend to have preferred areas and they will keep going back to those areas, and other areas that are less preferred they tend to avoid. So you can actually get overstocking or overgrazing and undergrazing in the same system. And so different folks have tried to incorporate different approaches to trying to minimize that. And the primary focus has been on stocking rate, or stocking rate plus distribution, as Kevin pointed out. Okay, and often we focus on percentage forage utilization. And I think that was the one comment made. Why is time important? If we just see how much we're utilizing, why do we worry about time? It's been used as a proxy for grazing intensity and is often operationalized by adjusting the number of animals or stocking rate on the land. However, and this is what Jenna's fundamental work is about, the complexity associated with some grazing management strategies has rendered percent forage utilization as a sole measure of grazing intensity insufficient, because we tend to focus on the grazing aspect. But Richard's talk was great in that he says the rest aspect is critically important, and for how long do you rest and when do you rest, and that's often not utilized. So what Jenna did in order to come to this new grazing intensity index, she applied a composite indicator construction and scale development methodology, and there's some references there. She then went into the literature review to identify different indicators of grazing intensity. And then she developed two novel indicators. And I suspect one of these might be equivalent to Kevin's stocking intensity, but I didn't have enough time to really think it through as he was talking. So the two novel indicators to address gaps in traditional indicators is this idea of effective stocking rate relative to stocking rate, or the stock days per unit land area currently being grazed relative to the overall stocking rate. And I think that probably is analogous to stocking intensity, but we have to have a discussion on that. And then the other aspect focuses on rest, the effective rest rate over the effective stocking rate, which is the rest days per stock day that each paddock receives per grazing cycle. Once she developed these two new indicators, she then evaluated the content validity by sending it out to a number of different people to ask for their feedback. And then she conducted a survey of 870 producers in North and South Dakota and Texas, got a good response rate, got different metrics from them to calculate these different indicators that I'm going to refer to just now. And then she calculated these grazing intensity metrics, and then ultimately derived a geometric mean aggregate indicator, which she called the grazing intensity index. It's a GWIS index. So these are the different elements, and I don't need to define them all. So I'm just going to run through them quickly, but grazing event length, period of time in a paddock, period of rest, the frequency, in other words, the return interval, how frequently animals return, then paddocks per herd ratio. That's often, what rotation systems focus on is what's the needed number of paddocks, and then stocking density, which Kevin defined, and then the stock rate to carrying capacity ratio, which is the forage demand relative to forage supply, and then these two new indicators that I just mentioned. So we can talk more about the indicators later, but just so that I can get through it. She then conducted a factor analysis where she tried to see which of these indicators collapse together into certain factors. And what turned out was really interesting. There were three fundamental factors. The first was the rest effect. And I'll point out in the next part of the slide here, that had the greatest explanatory power of the differences between the different types of system. We tend to focus on the grazing effect, how long, when, all those kind of things we have the animals in a particular paddock, or how over time. But then there's also the animal to land ratio effect. So those are the three factors that emerge from her factor analysis. And they explained in sequence here, the rest effect explained 36% of the variance among the different systems she was looking at. The grazing effect explained 30%, and the animal to land ratio explained about 23%. And then what she did was to collapse the data down. She used an aggregation approach where factor, so the factors are rest effect, grazing effect, animal to land ratio. She multiplied the indicator by the weighted ratios that you can see there. And so she did that for each of the three factors. And the overall grazing intensity index, she then did the same with the three factors to get one single index of grazing intensity. So what I'm going to show here is the mean values of individual grazing indicators, the rest effect, grazing effect, and these animal land ratios, and then the grazing intensity indicator, and the number of cases in each cluster. So she conducted a cluster of analysis with all the data that she had. And you will notice there, if you look on the last line, there were two extremes. One single case fell into cluster 1, another one fell into cluster 2. What you're going to see just now is these were actually remarkably similar, except for one thing. And that really comes out really clearly if you look at stock density and the stock ratio to carrying capacity. Cluster 5 was extremely high. That individual was doing one of two things, was doing the economically suicidal thing of feeding a lot, or utterly overgrazing their land. Okay, and then these clusters, this is what they're represented. So cluster 1 was a high intensity rotational grazing. I'm using the term just because everybody uses it, with 150 paddocks, 1 day in per paddock. Cluster 2 was often what is recommended as the moderate intensity rotational with 10 paddocks per herd, a few days in each paddock, or a few weeks in, sorry. And then cluster 3 was low intensity with just 3 paddocks per herd, 2 months in each paddock. And then the cluster 4 was the continuous grazing. And cluster 5, again, was moderate intensity grazing, but had a really high grazing intensity because of this high stocking rate to carrying capacity and stocking density ratio. And this is, these are box plots. I'm not going to go through everything, but essentially you can see the three factors there. On the right-hand side, you've got the grazing effects factor, then you've got the rest effects factor in the middle, and the animal to land ratio effects factor for each of the 5 clusters. What she found was clusters had distinct grazing intensity indices. So these systems, these different approaches broke out quite nicely into these 5 different clusters. And you can see there's some significant differences in their grazing intensity values. What was also interesting is that if we look at cluster 1 and 5, similar values for several indicators, but the combination of all indicators produced starkly different grazing intensity index. So if we compared those, you would see that they're quite similar for several of those factors. But if you look at that first little green box on the top there, you can see there's a very different grazing intensity index value. Whoops. And then also what she found was that there was quite a wide range of values for certain indicators. So if we look at C4 under the grazing intensity effect there on the top right-hand corner, you see there's quite a dispersion of values. And the same with the rest effect under for cluster for the rest period. There's quite a dispersion, but overall they had a similar. If you look again in the first green box there, that 3 and 4. I actually think that should be 2. Sorry, I might have made a mistake here. Anyway, but you can see that there's not a lot of difference in the grazing intensity index. So bottom line was, or comment here was, that if we consider grazing intensity index holistically, this leads to very different overall system descriptions than if we look at the indicators separately. And I think that's part of the problem, is that when people compare different systems, they focus on certain things that don't really tell you what the landowner is doing in terms of not just grazing, but really importantly rest, and also then in terms of the animal to land ratio. So in conclusion, she points out the multidimensional grazing intensity metric provides a more comprehensive and objective measure for distinguishing grazing management practices than individual indicators. But rather than comparing systems based on ill-defined grazing methods or grazing intensity based solely on forage utilization, studies should strive to differentiate these systems based on the GII, the grazing intensity index, to more comprehensively capture what you're actually doing within your management approach. Looking at individual indicators still may have value over time, because this may provide us with information about how we can adapt to changing conditions, both in the short term and in the long term. And then this may facilitate identification of threshold values for overall grazing intensity or individual indicators, which, when exceeded, would diminish the ecological and economic outcomes of the system. So bottom line is that individual indicators that we've often focused on, maybe even stocking intensity, may not be adequate for us to really capture what landowners are doing. And just to finish off the story, Jen and I did a field trip up to North and South Dakota one time to speak to landowners about what they were doing. And we wanted to find people who were continuous grazers and those who were high intensity rotational grazers. There is no such beast. It's really interesting because we found that those who call themselves continuous grazers often had multiple paddocks. They would split the herd into multiple paddocks, and then they would, so they're basically subdividing their land. That's not truly continuous year-long grazing. Whereas others who call themselves high-intensity rotational grazers had few paddocks. And it was interesting just to listen to people how they identified and what they were actually doing with what they were identifying as, excuse the contemporary term. That was really interesting because there was sometimes there was no connection. So maybe that's misunderstanding on their part, but it also means that everybody essentially does things differently. And so if we're going to say something meaningful about what a livestock producer is doing on their land, we need to look at their systems in a much more nuanced manner, perhaps, than what we have been doing. Those are some of the references, and I just included the abstract. So for those of you who want to read the abstract at the end, it'll be there too.
Thank you very much, Urs. The time is actually up, but it's so interesting. I'd allow one question if there's somebody who have a burning one. Kevin, first, don't go anywhere, please.
I was off the hook.
No, not yet.
Thanks, Urs. That's very interesting. And I like the idea of coming up with a more complex descriptor of what we're doing. I just want to ask a question on your resting index. Based on the formula that you used, does that take into account when the rest took place, whether a large part of it was over winter or not? For example, in the Southern Hemisphere, if your last grazing event was, say, at the end of March, and your next grazing event is the beginning of October, that might be about 6 months or 7 months, but it's all winter. So is it a rest? Is that taken into account?
That's a great question, Kevin, and I do not believe that was taken into consideration. So those are things that maybe need to be considered more, because obviously rest during a growing period has more benefit than rest during the dormant winter period. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. Our next presenter is an online video presentation by Brian Norton, and he's going to tell us a bit more about spatial and social attributes that we sometimes neglect when talking about and doing grazing research. Thank you very much.
One of the fascinating things about rangeland research that I find is the fact that we are still wrestling with the question of whether there is any advantage to rotational grazing over continuous grazing. and this is in spite of more than 70 years of research trials. But most surveys of all the published research have concluded that there is no benefit from rotational grazing to either forage production, vegetation health, or livestock production. And yet, livestock producers continue to practice rotational grazing in spite of these contrary research findings. And they claim higher productivity and more income. And I feel that we have an obligation to try to explain this difference between research performance and producer experience. I believe that the answer lies in the science. There would appear to be flaws in the research design that fail to match the circumstances of a commercial property. One such flaw is obviously a question of scale. Research trials are conducted in small paddocks with small numbers of livestock. And there is an implicit research assumption that the accessibility of forage is spatially homogeneous, and the utilization of that forage by grazing livestock is also spatially homogeneous, and that we can ignore any social interactions between individuals in the experimental groups of animal. And data sampling designs usually reflect the assumptions of spatial homogeneity. In other words, grazing animals have equal access to all parts of the paddock all the time. And in a small-scale trial, that is more or less true. However, in a commercial enterprise, livestock graze large paddocks over extensive landscapes. And across those extensive landscapes, access to forage is constrained by the amount of forage per hectare, paddock size, and of course its topography, the type of grazing livestock, the behavior of those grazing animals, and the grazing management applied to the system. Grazing over landscapes is spatially uneven, as every observation would indicate. Livestock develop spatial patterns of use based on where they find water, shade, based on the different vegetation types, topography, wind direction, etc. And those preferred areas and patches experience grazing pressure that is much higher than the pressure calculated for the overall paddock, the stocking rate in general. And there are a number of examples. Here's an 800-hectare paddock in New Zealand grazed by sheep, and the observations are reflected in this figure, where the dark area is where sheep presence was concentrated, and it had almost nothing to do with the water location in the paddock, but everything to do with wind direction. The sheep grazed into the wind. On the Mitchell Grass Plains in central Queensland, Australia, David Orr looked at utilization by sheep in 3 paddocks with 3 different stocking rates. And these were the effects of grazing after 15 to 20 years of use. And the sheep stocking rates ranged from 0.6 sheep per hectare up to more than 1 sheep per hectare. And as you look at the representations of the 3 treatments, the heavy hatched area represents heavy grazing, but almost unrelated to water sources. One of my favorite examples of uneven distribution was represented in a study by Senf and his associates, where they looked at the presence of 10 to 12 steers within a 125-hectare paddock over a 2-year period. And in their documentation of the concentration of presence, the darkest areas represent more than 5 hours grazing per day. And the very light area, less than 20 minutes grazing per day. The water point was not really related to the grazing distribution. But they looked at it in 2 seasons, a 7-month growing season of April to October, and then 5 months, November to March, over winter. And when you superimpose the data from those 2 seasons, you still see more than half the area experiencing less than 20 minutes grazing per day, basically neglected the majority of the 125 hectare paddock. Turning in contrast to a large paddock of 18,000 hectares on Todd River Station in Central Australia, 1,000 head of cattle were observed for 5 years, and their distribution, their presence in that paddock was recorded and shown here, the heavy grazing with a heavy hatched portrayal. And not really related to water distribution, but they had no problem moving 10 kilometers from water to graze. And they spent most of their time in woodland vegetation types, on the sand plain, and in the southeast corner on swampy areas that were, of course, dry most of the time. So as paddock size increases, we can expect unevenness of grazing impacts to increase. But even small grazed paddocks exhibit sharply uneven use. 2 examples from sheep trials using half-hectare paddocks for their treatments. This site was in northern New South Wales on Chiswick Research Station, where the researchers were interested in the water balance as it was affected by grazing impacts. And they set up a lysimeter down on the flat part of a topographic slope within the treatment half-hectare paddock. And the 5 sheep that were grazing in this little area spent most of their time on the higher part of the slope, close to water. Another study that I observed was at an Iranian research station, where once again they used half-hectare treatment paddocks, 6 sheep in each treatment rep, 2 reps, and they were recording the impacts of grazing treatments by sampling using quadrats on a grid. But the sheep wouldn't spend their time evenly over these half-hectare plots. They concentrated their presence and their heavy use at the corners of the experimental plots, where the 6 sheep like to have a chat over the fence to their neighbors. So we can say with some confidence that there is a disconnect between the distribution of grazing activity and the distribution of points for sampling to measure those grazing impacts. And therefore inferences from the data analysis will be distorted and conclusions from the trial will be unreliable. And finally, I want to look at a large paddock that was converted from continuous grazing to rotational grazing. And we have a combination of spatial and behavioral effects. And the paddock is located on Albion Downs in Western Australia, whereas with traditional management, continuous grazing, the sheep were spread evenly across 22 paddocks on this station. The paddocks were quite large, 3,000 to 5,000 hectares in size, and they were occupied by 250 to 300 sheep and kept there for the entire year. And what I could see when I walked through these paddocks and continuously grazed, that the flock of 300 sheep broke up into small groups of 15 to 20 head. And when a small group of sheep is disturbed, the individuals ran away furiously fast, almost in panic. Meanwhile, rams waited in the shade by a water point for a ewe in estrus to pass by, and then they pounced on her. When that paddock was converted to rotational grazing, and all the sheep were gathered into one large flock, there were 5,000 to 6,000 sheep altogether in that one paddock for 2 to 4 weeks. And I could observe a grazing front of that large combined sheep flock stretching about 1 kilometer wide. And when you approached that grazing front and encountered an individual sheep, it would respond by walking or trotting towards the large flock. Rams grazed with the flock, and lambing rate, as a result, doubled. So sheep in the rotation have a social attachment to other members of the flock instead of an attachment to grazing territories. Individual sheep are calmer when they're disturbed, and grazing is more evenly distributed across the landscape, which means that there is more social interaction and more area of the paddock is grazed. Heavily grazed patches do not develop. And there are implications for research. Research design should not assume spatial homogeneity of grazing or availability of forage. Grazing distribution is always spatially uneven, and therefore the estimate of grazing impacts should be spatially stratified and data collected according to that distribution of grazing impacts. The behavior of grazing animals drives the spatial distribution of grazing impacts. And above all, we need to avoid the ecological damage that's caused by patch grazing by a small flock in a large paddock. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brian is online if there is anybody who would like to pose a question to him. Okay, if not, there is one. Richard Finn would like to ask the question. Please.
Thanks, Brian. And I think some of that uneven distribution you were showing there also just indicates that animals will prefer to forage in areas probably with higher forage quality. So they're probably avoiding areas that grass has grown out and lost quality and focusing in on shorter areas where there's more quality. And that one you showed where the sheep focused on the top of the slope, that's often a classic wildlife effect where you see wildlife prefer in the growing season grazing on the tops of the slopes where the grass is shorter, and then they move to the downslope areas in the dry season. So that's a common effect as well. Thanks.
There is another question there at the back.
Yeah, I think more just to the young scientists here. All that we've really seen here is an example of why bad science is bad science. So like what we see all in this stuff is this unreplicated stuff where you have a pasture and there is spatial heterogeneity and animals behave like this. So the solution to any of these issues when you have a study is spatial replication, temporal repetition, and nest your sampling by known parameters that affect variability. So soil type, landscape position, that sort of stuff. And the one case that he showed where there was a bit of replication, 2 reps, they weren't independent. You had spatial autocorrelation between the herds. So I mean, just good study design pretty much ameliorates all of these issues in my mind.
Thank you very much for that comment. I don't know if Brian would like to reply. If not, Then we'll move on. Our next talks are all short presentations. The first one is Helga Knutse, and she will be coming to tell us a little bit about the FTON infrastructure in South Africa.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Helga, and I am the landscape scientist for biodiversity at FTON, and I'm based in the Kimberley landscape. And yes, like Lorraine said, I'm here to tell you a little bit about FTON and what we are all about. So the Expanded Freshwater and Terrestrial Environmental Observation Network is currently one of the research infrastructures being managed by the National Research Foundation, and being hosted by the NRF and also the South African Environmental Observation Network, or SAON. We strive to build upon the vision of the NRF, which is expressed as research for a better society, and also the vision of SAON, which is to provide world-class environmental research platforms for a sustainable society. So together with these visions, FTON's mission is therefore to offer public value through the provisioning of long-term multidisciplinary observation platforms that are designed to clarify Earth system dynamics, changes over multiple scales, and then also to distinguish between natural and anthropogenic environmental change. So among others, FTON's goals include the development of open access data systems and tools to provide reliable long-term observational data, to supply and share these data, of course, always to strive for excellence, training and capacity development, community science engagement, stakeholder consultation, collaboration. You cannot say that only once anymore. And then, of course, to ultimately have a natural environment conducive to sustained life on Earth. Now, the observational design of FTON is based on the development of 6 different landscapes across South Africa, and the important human ecosystem networks and also the aquatic ecosystems within these networks. So each landscape, which include the Garden Route Gateway, Greater Cape Town, Kimberley, Lowveld, the Northern KwaZulu-Natal or Maputaland, and the Northern Drakensberg, will have standardized sets of automated instruments that will measure carbon and water cycles, meteorology and air quality, and then also a range of standard repeated measures to cover biodiversity, productivity, ecosystem condition, ecosystem service provision and use. And each landscape will also have secondary or satellite sites with elementary standard automated instruments for the measurement or the monitoring of climate and freshwater systems, as well as repeated measurements such as socio-ecological survey data. FTON furthermore aims to support and promote long-term environmental observations, research and data collection in the rangelands of South Africa following a transdisciplinary approach, distributing landscape-scale research infrastructure, facilitating research at different scales within and between these landscapes, and then also ultimately trying to link some science themes that include ecohydrology, carbon and nutrient cycles, soil and sediments, biodiversity, disturbance regimes and their outcomes, climate and the atmosphere, and then also social ecological systems. And to this end, and to also further enhance the transdisciplinarity, FTON supports the inclusion of local or indigenous land users and their knowledge through the relevant indigenous knowledge systems. So if any of you are interested in the long-term monitoring in any of these science themes, please come and visit me at poster number 4 during the poster session so we can have a chat, exchange details, and try to better understand and conserve the landscapes across our beautiful country. And that's just the tweet that I'm going to tweet later when I have a nice photo next to my poster. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Helga. I see a hand here. Justin, a comment, and I look forward to coming to see your poster.
Thanks very much for that presentation. As I understand it, the lowest rainfall, apart from the satellite sites near Prince Albert, is about 400 mils at Kimberley. is there any plan to access information from the sort of the third of the country that falls into a lower rainfall than that, including the western succulent Karoo, the arid savannas, and the whole of the Nama Karoo?
Yes, so I'm based in Kimberley, there where the grassland, Nama Karoo, and Savannah all congregate. So yes, Justin, there's definitely a lot of scope for new projects to see what's happening in the more arid areas. So yes, definitely.
Thank you very much, Clive, with that presentation. All right, thank you very much, Helga. Our next speaker is also a short presentation, and that's Manchi Palmer. And I think she will be giving us a brief introduction to the session that actually follows this one, because she'll be talking about tillage and no tillage and various morphological characteristics of grass species. Thank you.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. As they say, my name is Miriam Manji. I'm just... Oh, sorry for that. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. As they say, my name is Miriam Manji. And then I'm just going to present my poster. And the title of my poster is The Agronomic and Morphological Characteristics of 5 Grass Species Grown at different growth stage under tillage and non-tillage system in the Sourish Bushveld. And you just please sorry. Introduction. As you know, inadequate forage quantity and quality are significant threats for livestock production, which actually is leading to the ruminants failing to maintain their daily dry matter and nutritional requirements. However, establishing the complementary native grass species may address forage shortage in pastures. Material and methods. The study evaluated the effective of tillage and non-tillage management system on the agronomical performance and morphological characteristics traits of 5 grass species at different growth stages. The study was conducted as 2x5 factorial structure under RCVD. The grass species studies were Anthraphra prudensis, Floris guyana, Argrostic cavula, Synchra ciliaris, and a species with a mixture of different grass species referred to as a bush mix. Each species was planted in a subplot of 2 by 5 meters square. The species between the row and the inter-row spacing was 1 meter spacing per plot. Data collected, this is because for presentation of 5 minutes, I couldn't put so much data. This is just like the preliminary data. The data was collected on the germination, flourishing, the number of roots, the crown, and the biomass. The results. The results for morphological traits and biomass yield are given in figure 1 and 2. I will show the figure because of the time. You will see the results after this slides. The results for morphological traits and biological biomass yield are given in figure 1 to 3 and table 1 and table 2. At the germination percentage within the grass species, Floris guyana, Synchra ciliaris, and Bushmans had the highest germination percentage at the probability of greater than 0.05. While Erogrostic cavula had the lowest under both tillage and non-tillage management system. At the flowering stage, the results were observed that Floris guyana, Synchra ciliaris, and Anthraphra prudensis had a similar percentage flowering under tillage management system. At the Under the number of roots at the elongation stage, Chloris Guyana had the highest roots number at 69.36 centimeter, while Ergrosti Kevula had the lowest at 37.6 centimeter on tillage management system. Under biomass production, regarding the biomass production, at the maturity and aggregation stage, at the no tillage stage, Anthrapsa prudensis, B mix, and Synchracilarius had produced significantly more biomass than Chloris Guyana and Ergrosti Kevula. Within grass species at maturity, on the effect of grass species, tillage, tillage and no tillage and growth stages, on crown of selected grass species. Within the grass species at the maturity and elongation stage, Synchracilarius, Chloris Guyana, and B mix had the thickest crown amongst them all. This is the results. As I already said, here I will just show the results according to this is our result in terms of the species and the growth state on the germination stage. As you can see, already explain how the difference between different grasses. Okay, this one is also for flowering stage. But I already says because it was only 3 minutes presentation. Thank you very much.
Sorry for rushing you. Unfortunately, there's no time for questions. But the poster is up there, so if you have any questions over tea time, please be available so that you can answer questions. Thank you very much. Hey, then the last presentation in this session that would lead us to tea is Matome Maila, and they will be giving a presentation on processing methods and seed recovery after the ingestion of various encroaching tree species. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. I go by the name Nelson Maila, and I'll be giving a short talk entitled Assessing Different Fodder Processing Methods and Seed Recovery After Ingestion of Various Encroaching Tree Species. Now, we can all agree that livestock production is an integral part of the communal farming system. The problem is that the problem with it is animal feed supply and quantity is aggregated in the arid, semi-arid, and tropical regions, with scarce rainfall that limits the growth of herbaceous species and biomass yield in the rangelands. But however, the availability of leguminous trees could be exploited to improve the nutritional status of goats during the dry season. Now, in this study, we aim to evaluate the nutritional quality of Marcellia nilotica, Tortolis, Paru, and Dicrostachya cinerea at different phenological stages. Thereafter, to determine how the different processing and storage techniques will influence its nutritional quality, followed by evaluating the risks associated with seed recovery after ingestion on the potential dispersal leading to further encroachment. Now, the objective of this study is to determine whether the quality of the different fodders and efficiency of utilization can be improved by inclusion of feed additives, application of different processing techniques, which is namely the chipping, the pelleting, and the ensilage. Coming to the methodology, we have 4 different tree species, but let me explain it as if I'm explaining it for one species because the methodology will be the same for all of them. harvest in the different growth stages. After harvesting in those different growth stages, we'll do a nutritional quality where we'll analyze for minerals, fiber contents, protein, in vitro organic matter digestibility, and energy, total phenolics and condensed tannins. And from there, we'll select the best stage. After selecting the best stage from that nutritional quality, we'll use the best stage that we selected to proceed and create feed through the chipping, the pelleting, and the silage method. After that, we'll still do the nutritional quality because we'll have feed additives involved in it and see the differences from what we get. Ultimately, after that, the second part of the study, we'll be doing a feeding trial and a seed recovery. From there, we'll see from the seeds that are recovered, that's if they are recovered, the germination potential of them. So from this study, what we are expecting, these are the expected outcomes and implications, is to assist in selecting the best stage of harvesting from the different phenological stages and to establish their potential as animal feed when appropriate processing methods are used. It is also to mitigate possible risks associated with post-ingestive seed recovery, viability of the recovered seed, and seed dispersal of invasive species. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelson. Sweet and short. Is there any question directed specifically to Nelson? Again, he will be at his poster during tea. So if you want to have some discussions with him one-on-one, then thank you very much. Then we don't have as much time as I wished for, but there's about 5 minutes. Is there any questions to any of our speakers in the session? Susie, yes?
Thanks. It's for Earth. I really like this index that is an attempt to go beyond these one-dimensional ways of separating or classifying grazing systems. And your PhD students used actual farmers' data to sort of classify existing practice into. But one of the things that kept coming up is the difficulty with meta-analyses of published studies because of the crude classification. You're comparing oranges and apples with pineapples and mangoes. Do you think this index, or are there plans to use this index or a version of it to do proper meta-analysis of published grazing studies, trials and whatever, to try and also overcome what Brian was sort of referring to is, we oversimplify when we try and, retrospectively compare the results from different studies.
Thanks, Susie. In the paper that is coming out of this, it hopefully should have been submitted. It's going to be submitted. There are evaluations of some of the experiments that actually were quoted. Richard quoted the one by Augustine et al. In Colorado, where they claim to compare continuous versus rotational grazing, and she points out actually they weren't doing that at all, and using this index to indicate that they're not reflecting the grazing intensity that would normally be the case associated with those kind of systems. And there are others. I'm not just picking on that one, but she goes back and she looks at some previous studies. So as far as a meta-analysis, that hasn't been conducted yet. There is another researcher, Tim, going the blank, in Texas, who has actually gone back and looked at all of the information from that was in the Brisky et al. Paper plus. I can't remember. There's over 100 different case studies that he's incorporated in that to look at the inconsistencies in terms of what these producers are actually doing. He's not aware of this GII yet, but maybe we can incorporate that there too. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just wanted to I think I welcomed our online guest. Is there a question from the online platform? Thanks.
Yes, there is one. It's from Craig Morris for Kevin. An intensity of 10 AU days per hectare could be 10 AUs per 1 day per hectare or 1 AU per 10 days per hectare. Will there be very different grazing and trampling effects?
Thanks, Craig, for a difficult question. Yes, I think they will be, because if you have the animals, 10 animals in for 1 day, they will move through that paddock quite quickly and graze everything relatively uniformly. If you have one animal in the paddock for 10 days, it's going to have a different grazing pattern. And I think that my preference would be for the shorter grazing period, but remember the grazing intensity is the same. So the animals will get the same amount of forage, but I think the impact on the vegetation will be better having the higher stocking intensity, the shorter grazing period at the same stocking intensity.
Thank you very much. I think that brings us to the end of the session. Let me take this opportunity to thank all the speakers and all the contributions and questions from the audience as well.